The wind carried the last breath of sunset across Redstone Crossing, brushing the dirt road with colors that seemed too soft for a place so harsh. Ayanna Redfeather, age 20, stood at the edge of the trading post, clutching her worn blue shawl the way a drowning soul might cling to the air above water. The murmurs from the townsfolk drifted toward her, sharp as broken pottery and just as careless, and she tried to pretend she couldn't hear them as her eyes followed the fading gold sky like it held the only kindness left in her life. But someone was watching her from the dim glow of the stable doorway, his gaze quiet and unhurried, as though her sorrow had reached him before her shadow ever did. Colton Hale, age 30, tightened the leather straps on his Mustang with hands that bore more scars than years, each one a story he never bothered to tell. He had noticed Ayanna before, many times, in truth, moving through town like a whisper no one wanted to hear. Something about her loneliness tugged at him, like an old ache stirring in bones he had tried to forget. He brushed dust from the horse's flank with deliberate slowness, but it didn't stop his eyes from drifting toward her as though drawn by some unspoken pull. And when she finally shifted her weight and glanced his way, her gaze met his for a heartbeat that felt strangely like the world pausing in the middle of its spin. She looked away quickly, shame flushing her cheeks in a faint rose that made her appear even more fragile against the raw wood of the trading post. She believed she had nothing of value, no family, no protection, no place, but she didn't know that her quiet, trembling strength caught Colton's attention more deeply than words ever could. She stepped away from the building and headed toward the riverbank, her footsteps soft, her shawl slipping from one shoulder like it had grown tired of trying to hold her together. And Colton found himself taking one slow step after her, before stopping as if afraid she might look back and see all the things he couldn't yet say. The town's lanterns began to glow in dusty windows, but the river shimmered with moonlight that made the world feel nearly forgiving. Ayanna knelt by the willow roots, letting her fingers graze the water as though it were a memory she wished she could step into. The breeze carried the scent of wet soil and faint sage, and she breathed deeply, even though each breath seemed to hurt. She closed her eyes, leaning forward until her forehead touched her knees, and for a moment she imagined she could disappear inside the hush of night. But she stiffened suddenly, sensing footsteps behind her. Not harsh ones, but steady, weighted with something she didn't yet understand. Colton lingered a short distance away, clearing his throat gently to avoid startling her. She turned, her braids sliding over her shoulder like a ribbon of night. He offered a soft nod, neither approaching nor retreating, and the space between them felt like a fragile bridge made of breath alone. She wasn't used to kindness, not from men, not from townsfolk, not from anyone, and she didn't know what to do with the warmth slipping into her chest simply because he hadn't looked at her with disdain. And she wondered, just for a heartbeat, why a man like him would look at her as though she were something worth noticing at all. She murmured a greeting, her voice thin but polite, and he replied with a gentleness that surprised even himself. They spoke only briefly, small words about the river, about the quiet, about how the town felt heavier lately, but something in those moments felt like a small lantern being lit between two wandering souls. Ayanna tried to pull her shawl tighter, but her hands trembled, and Colton pretended not to notice as he looked toward the water with a thoughtful, silent ache he wasn't ready to name. And she sensed that he carried his own loneliness, shaped differently than hers but equally deep. The next morning, Redstone Crossing was soaked in the sharp scent of freshly cut pine as the summer festival preparations began. Flags fluttered from dusty windowsills, and laughter echoed between buildings, though none of it belonged to Ayanna. She walked on the outskirts, unsure if stepping closer would anger people or simply amuse them. Her braids swayed quietly with each hesitant step, and she tried to blend into shadows that no longer felt deep enough to hide her. But her breath caught the moment she saw Colton approaching with soft intention in each stride. He asked if she would walk the festival grounds with him, the offer sincere and unembellished. Her fingers clenched the edge of her shawl as she stared at him, searching his eyes for mockery and finding none. She took a slow breath and nodded. Together, they stepped forward, though each inch into the crowd felt like walking into a storm she had spent her whole life trying to avoid. The whispers began almost instantly, women murmuring, men snickering, children staring as though she were a spectacle instead of a person, and she felt something inside her crack, fragile as eggshell under an unkind hand. When one woman muttered loudly that a stray girl shouldn't walk beside a decent cowboy, Ayanna stopped in her tracks, her face burning. She stepped away from Colton, shaking her head, trying to keep tears from spilling. The laughter behind her jabbed at old wounds, and she felt the weight of every lonely year pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She took 2 stumbling steps backward, bumping into a lantern post, and the shame rising in her throat tasted almost metallic. And Colton, seeing the pain devour her, felt something fierce and protective ignite in his chest. But before he could reach her, 3 ranch hands stepped in front of Ayanna, blocking her path with greasy grins and taunting eyes. They tugged her shawl from her shoulders and tossed it into the dirt. Her breath hitched, and she reached for it instinctively, but one man kicked it aside, laughing. She flinched, her body curling inward as if she expected a blow rather than more humiliation. Her mind screamed for escape, for a single moment of dignity, but her legs felt like stone, and in the next instant a hand closed around her elbow, not to harm but to hold her steady. Colton stepped between her and the men with a calm that felt more dangerous than anger. His voice was low, steady, each word dipped in warning as he told the ranch hands to move on. They scoffed, until one met Colton's eyes and found no wavering there, only a promise of trouble. One by one, they backed away, muttering under their breath but unwilling to push further. Ayanna clutched her shawl as Colton retrieved it, brushing dust from the fabric with care before draping it gently around her shoulders. And her heart trembled, unsure how to carry kindness given so quietly. He guided her away from the noise, toward a clearing near the festival stage. Lanterns lit the air with flickering gold, and music swelled behind them like a distant memory of joy. Ayanna breathed shakily, tears staining her cheeks as she murmured apologies she didn't owe. Colton shook his head softly, assuring her that none of this was her shame to carry, and she felt something warm stir in her ribs, something like hope, something like danger, something like the beginning of wanting. But the pain inside her had built too high, too fast, and it demanded release in the most desperate way. She stepped forward suddenly, brushing past him into the center of the festival grounds, ignoring the gasps that followed her. Lantern light trembling across her face made her tears glisten like carved crystal. She lifted her chin, though her voice shook like a young willow in a storm. And with every ounce of courage left in her soul, she called out to Colton, her words slicing through the music, the laughter, the judgment. "I have no one. Please accept me as your wife in front of everyone." And the world froze, each heartbeat held captive in stunned silence. Colton stood motionless, the crowd turning their eyes between them like spectators at an execution rather than a plea for belonging. Ayanna's hands trembled uncontrollably, her breath catching as she realized she had laid her soul bare before a town that never cared if she lived or vanished. Her knees wobbled, but she stayed upright, refusing to retreat from what she had asked. The lanterns swayed in a sudden breeze, casting shifting shadows across her face like flickering doubts. And Colton felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of her trust wrapping around his ribs. He walked toward her slowly, each step a vow forming silently inside him. When he reached her, he lifted her chin with a single gentle finger, making her meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath stop, because there was no pity, no hesitation, only warmth blooming like dawn after a long night. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he took her trembling hand and placed it over his heart, letting her feel the steady, earnest beat beneath her palm. And the crowd leaned forward, unsure if they were witnessing scandal or something sacred. Finally, Colton spoke, his voice calm and rich with unvarnished truth. He told the town that he would take her as his wife not because she pleaded, not because she was alone, but because he had begun to love her long before she ever dared to look his way. He said she carried a gentleness that the world had tried to crush, and he would spend his life making sure she never felt unwanted again. Ayana's tears spilled freely, but this time they were soft, trembling with disbelief and fragile joy. And before the crowd could gather breath to protest, a preacher stepped forward, compelled by the moment. The preacher opened his worn Bible, lantern light spilling over the pages like spilled honey. Colton took both of Ayana's hands in his, anchoring her trembling. The preacher's voice rose gently, asking if they vowed to honor and cherish each other for as long as the sun rose over the plains. Ayana's voice quivered as she said yes, her words shaking like a leaf clinging to its branch. Colton's answer was firm, steady, unshakable, like the earth beneath their feet. And as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the world seemed to exhale around them. Colton lifted her shawl as though it were a veil and brought his lips to hers with a tenderness that made even the harshest onlookers fall silent. It wasn't a kiss of spectacle but one of promise, slow, careful, filled with a devotion that neither of them could have named a day earlier. Ayana's hands trembled against his chest, but her heart opened like a blossom warming beneath sunlight for the first time. And the night around them felt like it held its breath, reluctant to let go of the moment. He guided her from the festival toward his cabin on the outskirts of town, their shadows dancing across the ground like two travelers finally reaching the same path. Inside the cabin, lamplight painted the rough-hewn walls in warm streaks, and Ayana felt the strange, overwhelming sensation of belonging. She touched the edge of the table, the frame of the window, the grain of the wooden chair, as though memorizing the shape of a life she never expected to have. Colton watched her quietly, giving her space to breathe. And when she finally turned toward him, something soft and unspoken passed between them like a familiar language. He approached slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingertips lingering a moment longer than necessary. She rested her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat calm and steady, and realized she no longer feared the world outside, not when this cabin held a warmth she had longed for all her life. They lay beside each other, wrapped in gentle silence, their breaths sinking like two rivers finally meeting. Sleep claimed them in a tender hush, and dawn rose softly, as though it too wished to witness what they had become. Morning light spilled through the cabin window, warm as a blessing. Ayana woke to the scent of pan bread warming on the stove and Colton moving quietly so as not to disturb her. When he turned and saw her watching him, he offered a shy smile, one that softened the entire room. She rose, walked into his open arms, and rested her cheek against his chest, breathing in the comfort that now belonged to both of them. His hand slid along her back, steady and loving, grounding her in a way she'd never known. And for the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of what it meant to be cherished. The world outside would still whisper, still judge, still find ways to doubt their union. But within the wooden walls of their cabin, Ayana had a place to stand, and Colton had someone who understood the softness in his strength. Their forever would not be built in grand gestures but in each small moment of kindness, hands brushing during morning chores, shared laughter over burned biscuits, quiet nights beneath starlit skies. They would grow into their love slowly, gently, beautifully. And somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried their promise into the world, as if blessing the start of a lifetime. And if you, dear wanderer, find yourself reading these words with a quiet ache in your chest, let Ayana and Colton's journey rest gently in your heart. Remember that sometimes the world will try to convince you that you are unworthy, unseen, or unloved, but the truth is softer and far more enduring. You deserve a place where your voice is not merely heard but held, where your trembling becomes courage, and where someone looks at you the way sunrise looks at the earth it warms. Do not be afraid to ask for the life your soul longs for, because somewhere out there is a heart brave enough to choose you, exactly as you are, and that choice can change everything.